In the autumn of 1998, a pediatrician in rural Pennsylvania noticed something impossible during a routine checkup. The child on the examination table, a boy named Thomas Crawford, age 4, had a crescent-shaped scar just below his left shoulder blade. It looked old, healed years before, but his mother insisted he'd never been injured there, never had surgery, never even fallen that hard. The doctor made a note in the file and moved on. But 3 years later, when Thomas's younger sister came in for her checkup, the same doctor froze. There, in the exact same location, was the exact same scar. Crescent-shaped, faded like old leather, impossible to explain. When pressed, both children said the same thing: "We've always had it. It's from before." Before what? Neither child could say, but they both remembered the same dream. A room with stone walls, a woman singing, and the smell of burning wool. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. What I'm about to tell you isn't folklore. It isn't an urban legend whispered around campfires. This is documented. This is real. And for more than 200 years, the Crawford family has carried a secret so dark, so unnervingly consistent, that even they stopped talking about it. Every child born into the Crawford bloodline comes into the world with the same scar. And by the age of 3 or 4, they all begin describing the same memory, a memory that doesn't belong to them, a memory from someone else's death. This is the story the family tried to bury. This is the story that won't stay dead. The Crawford family tree stretches back to 1763, when a woman named Miriam Crawford arrived in Chester County, Pennsylvania, alone and pregnant. No husband, no family, no explanation for where she'd come from. The local parish records describe her as a woman of silent disposition and unnerving countenance. She gave birth to a daughter in the winter of 1764. The midwife who attended the birth later told the parish priest something strange. The baby had a mark on her back, a crescent-shaped discoloration, like a burn that had healed before the child was ever born. The midwife called it a witch's mark. Miriam called it a blessing. That daughter, named Constance, grew up and had children of her own. All 4 of them were born with the same mark. By the 1820s, the family had stopped calling it a scar. They called it the sign. And they stopped talking about it to outsiders entirely. But the scar was only half of it. In 1837, a school teacher in the township wrote a letter to a colleague describing an unusual conversation she'd had with 2 Crawford children. Both had independently told her about a dream they kept having. A stone room, a woman's voice singing in a language they didn't recognize, the smell of something burning, and a pain in their backs, just below the shoulder blade, sharp and searing, like a brand being pressed into flesh. The teacher found the coincidence troubling. She asked the children's mother about it. The mother's response was brief and cold. "They'll forget it soon enough. All Crawford children do." But they didn't forget. By the time the children reached adolescence, the dreams faded but the memory remained. And it wasn't vague. It was specific, detailed, visceral. They remembered the texture of the stone walls, the sound of the woman's voice, the way the light came through a single, narrow window. And they all remembered the same final moment, a sudden, crushing pain, and then nothing. It was as if they had all died the same death. Over the decades, the family developed an unspoken rule. Don't talk about the scar. Don't talk about the memory. And whatever you do, don't ask what it means. But in 1941, someone finally did. His name was Dr. Robert Halloran, and he wasn't looking for the Crawfords. He was a psychiatrist based in Philadelphia, specializing in childhood trauma and what he called inherited memory phenomena, the idea that extreme psychological experiences could somehow imprint themselves across generations. It was fringe work, even for 1941. His colleagues thought he was chasing ghosts, but then he met Eleanor Crawford. She was 8 years old, brought to his office by her father after weeks of night terrors. She would wake up screaming, clawing at her back, begging someone to stop. Her father was a practical man, a veteran of the First World War, and he didn't believe in superstition. But he couldn't explain his daughter's terror, and he couldn't explain the scar she'd been born with. Dr. Halloran began documenting Eleanor's sessions. In his notes, he describes her as unnervingly articulate for her age and possessed of a memory that does not belong to her. Under light hypnosis, Eleanor described the stone room in perfect detail. She described the woman's song and even hummed a melody that Halloran later identified as a Scottish lullaby from the early 18th century, a song Eleanor had never heard in her waking life. She described the smell, not just burning wool, but burning flesh beneath it. And then she said something that made Halloran stop writing. She didn't fight them. She just kept singing. She wanted us to remember the song, not the fire. Halloran asked who she was. Eleanor didn't know, but she said the name that the woman had been called, over and over, by the voices outside the room. Miriam. Halloran's hands were shaking when he wrote that name down. After the session, he asked Eleanor's father about the family history. The father was reluctant, but finally admitted, the first Crawford in America, the woman who started the line, was named Miriam. She'd come from somewhere in Scotland, alone and pregnant, and settled in Pennsylvania in the 1760s. She had died in 1791, burned to death. The father didn't know the details. No one in the family did. It had been scrubbed from the records, buried by shame or fear, or both. But the story had been whispered down through the generations. Miriam Crawford had been accused of witchcraft, and she had been executed for it. Dr. Halloran spent the next 2 years trying to find proof. He combed through parish records, court documents, land deeds. He found almost nothing. Miriam Crawford's name appeared only 3 times in official records: her arrival, the birth of her daughter, and her death. No trial, no testimony, no explanation. But in 1943, Halloran found something else. A letter. The letter was tucked inside a Bible that had been donated to a historical society in Chester County. It had been written in 1791, just days before Miriam Crawford's death, and it was addressed to her daughter, Constance. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. Parts of it were nearly illegible, but the message was clear. Miriam knew she was going to die. In the letter, she describes the accusations against her: a stillborn calf, a child's fever that wouldn't break, a man's wife who miscarried twice in 1 year. The townspeople had decided she was responsible. They called her a witch, a curse on the land. She writes that she tried to reason with them, tried to explain that she was just a woman, alone and afraid, trying to raise her daughter in peace. But reason didn't matter. Fear had taken root. She writes that they came for her on a cold October night. They dragged her from her home while Constance screamed. They locked her in a stone cellar beneath the parish church, a room used for storing wine and grain, a room with walls so thick no one could hear you scream. And then she writes something that makes your blood run cold. They have marked me, as they marked the others before me. A crescent brand upon the back, so that God might know the devil's servants when we stand before him. But I am not what they say I am. I am only a mother, and I will not let them take that from me. She describes the branding in detail, the iron heated until it glowed, the smell of her own flesh burning, the way she forced herself to stay silent, to deny them the satisfaction of hearing her scream. And then she writes about the song. I sang to Constance every night when she was small. I sang the song my own mother sang to me, in the old tongue, before I was cast out. I sang it as they held me down. I sang it as they burned me, and I will sing it when they light the fire that takes my life. Let them hear it, let them remember, and let my blood remember, long after I am gone. Dr. Halloran read that letter 12 times. He couldn't understand what she meant by, let my blood remember. But Eleanor Crawford could. When he showed her the letter translated, simplified, stripped of its most disturbing details, she looked at him with an expression he would later describe as too old for her face. She said, "She's still singing. That's why we hear her." Halloran asked what she meant. Eleanor said that the memory wasn't just a memory, it was a message. Miriam had done something in that cellar, something in the moments before her death. She had pushed the memory outward, into her daughter, into her blood, into every child who would ever come after her. She had made sure they would never forget. Halloran didn't believe in curses, he didn't believe in magic, but he couldn't explain what he was seeing. He couldn't explain how children born 200 years after Miriam's death could describe the texture of the stone walls in that cellar, couldn't explain how they knew the melody of a song that had never been written down, and he couldn't explain the scar. In the spring of 1944, Dr. Halloran did something that would end his career. He traveled to Chester County with Eleanor Crawford and her father. He wanted to find the cellar. He wanted to see if it was real. The parish church where Miriam had been held was still standing, though it had been abandoned for decades. The building had been sold off in the 1880s and turned into a storage barn. By the time Halloran arrived, it was barely more than a shell. The roof had caved in, the walls were crumbling, but the foundation was intact, and beneath it, sealed behind a rotted wooden door, was the cellar. Halloran brought a flashlight and a notebook. Eleanor's father brought a crowbar. They pried the door open and descended into the dark. The air was thick and damp, and the smell God. The smell was like old smoke and something else, something rotten and sweet that had soaked into the stone. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 12. The walls were gray fieldstone, just as Eleanor had described. There was a single window, narrow and high, now boarded over from the outside, and in the center of the room, burned into the dirt floor, was a crescent shape. Halloran knelt down and touched it. The earth was still discolored, still darker than the soil around it, as if something had scorched it so deeply that 2 centuries couldn't wash it away. Eleanor stood in the doorway. She wouldn't come inside. Her father asked if she was all right. She didn't answer. She was staring at the far wall, at a spot just above the window, where something had been carved into the stone. It was a symbol. Not a word. Not a letter. Just a single crescent, etched deep into the rock. Halloran asked her if she recognized it. She nodded. That's where she put her hand, Eleanor said quietly. Right before they came for her, she put her hand there and she said something. I don't know what it was, but I can feel it. Halloran looked at her. Feel what? Her, Eleanor whispered. She's still here. Eleanor's father had heard enough. He grabbed his daughter's hand and pulled her back toward the stairs. But before they left, Halloran took a photograph. Just one. The stone wall. The carved crescent. The window above it. When he developed the photograph a week later, he noticed something he hadn't seen in the cellar. In the lower right corner of the image, just barely visible in the shadows, was a shape. It looked like a hand. A woman's hand. Pressed flat against the stone. Halloran never published his findings. He never wrote about the Crawfords again. He locked his notes in a filing cabinet and refused to speak about the case, even to his colleagues. When asked why, he would only say, "Some things are not meant to be remembered, and some things will not let you forget." He died in 1962. His files were donated to a university archive, where they sat untouched for nearly 30 years. But the Crawford family kept growing, and every child born into that line came into the world with the same scar. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. By the early 2000s, the Crawford family had spread across 15 states. Some had changed their names. Some had moved as far as California, trying to outrun the whispers and the stares and the questions they couldn't answer. But the scar followed them, and so did the memory. In 2006, a woman named Dr. Sarah Crawford, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University, decided to do what no one in her family had ever dared. She started testing the family's DNA. She wanted to know if there was something biological, something molecular, that could explain the scar. A genetic mutation, a hereditary condition, anything scientific. She collected samples from 43 living members of the Crawford line, cousins she'd never met, distant relatives who didn't even know they were related. All of them had the scar. All of them remembered the room. The results came back normal. No genetic markers, no abnormalities, no mutations that would explain a birthmark passed down for 240 years with perfect consistency. But then she found something else. In the mitochondrial DNA genetic material passed exclusively through the maternal line, there was an anomaly. Not a mutation, not damage, but a pattern. A repeating sequence that didn't match anything in the genetic databases. It was as if someone had written a message into the DNA itself, A message that had been copied and passed down, mother to child, generation after generation, without error and without decay. Dr. Crawford sent the sequence to a colleague who specialized in bioinformatics. He ran it through every analysis tool he had, and then he called her, his voice shaking, and told her to come to his lab immediately. He had converted the sequence into sound. It was a melody, the same melody Eleanor Crawford had hummed in Dr. Halloran's office 65 years earlier. The same melody every Crawford child heard in their dreams. A Scottish lullaby from the 1700s, embedded in the genetic code of every living descendant of Miriam Crawford. Dr. Sarah Crawford sat in that lab and listened to the recording 3 times. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, she just listened. And when it was over, she asked her colleague to delete the file. He refused. He said it was the most significant discovery of his career, that it could rewrite everything we know about genetic memory and inherited trauma. He wanted to publish. He wanted the world to know. Dr. Crawford looked at him and said, "If you publish this, you'll ruin lives. You'll turn my family into a carnival act, and you'll wake something up that should stay asleep." He published anyway. The paper came out in 2007. It made headlines for a week. Geneticists called it groundbreaking. Skeptics called it pseudoscience. The Crawford family called it a betrayal. And then the children started talking. All over the country, Crawford children who had never experienced the dreams before, children as young as 2 and 3, suddenly began waking up screaming. They clawed at their backs. They begged for the singing to stop. They described the stone room, the woman's voice, the smell of burning flesh. It was as if the publication of the paper had triggered something, as if bringing the secret into the light had made it stronger. Dr. Sarah Crawford tried to have the paper retracted. She contacted the journal. She threatened legal action. But the damage was done. The story was out, and the memory, Miriam's memory, was awake in a way it hadn't been for generations. By 2009, Dr. Crawford had stopped practicing science. She moved to a small town in Vermont, far from her family, far from the questions. She never spoke publicly about her research again. But in 2014, she gave one interview. Just one. To a podcast that specialized in unexplained phenomena. She said, "My ancestor didn't curse us. She saved us. She made sure we would remember what they did to her. She made sure we would carry her pain, her voice, her truth. And maybe that's not a curse. Maybe that's the only justice she could ever have." Today, there are over 200 known descendants of Miriam Crawford living in the United States. Most of them have never met. Most of them don't want to. But they all carry the same scar. And they all know the song. In 2019, a group of them gathered for the first time. It wasn't planned as a reunion. It started as a private online forum, a place where Crawford descendants could talk about the dreams, the scar, the weight of carrying a memory that didn't belong to them. Slowly, carefully, they began to share their stories, and they realized something. The memory wasn't the same for everyone anymore. The older generations, those born before 2000, remembered the stone room, the singing, the moment of death. But the children born after 2007, after the paper was published, after the story went public, they remembered something else. They remembered what came after. A Crawford girl from Oregon, age 9, described it in a drawing she made for her school counselor. In the picture, a woman stands in a field of tall grass, her back to the viewer. She's holding a child's hand. The sky above them is dark, but there's light coming from somewhere beneath the ground. The counselor asked what the picture meant. The girl said, "That's Miriam. She's not in the room anymore. She's waiting." "Waiting for what?" the counselor asked. "For us to stop being afraid of her." A teenage boy in Michigan told his therapist that the dreams had changed. He didn't see the cellar anymore. He saw Miriam walking through the woods at night, her arms outstretched, her mouth open in song. Not a lullaby. Something else. Something older. "She's calling us home," he said, "but I don't know where home is." In 2022, a documentary filmmaker tried to make a movie about the Crawford family. She contacted dozens of descendants. Almost all of them refused to participate, but one woman agreed to speak on the condition that her face not be shown and her voice be disguised. She said this, "People think we're cursed. They think Miriam haunts us, but that's not what this is. She's not a ghost. She's not a monster. She's a mother who refused to disappear. They tried to erase her. They tried to burn her out of history. And she said no. She took the pain they gave her and she turned it into something they couldn't destroy. She turned it into us. The filmmaker asked if she resented carrying that burden. The woman was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Every time I look at my daughter's back and I see that scar, I think about what it cost for us to be here. I think about the fact that Miriam could have let herself be forgotten. She could have let the fire take everything. But she didn't. She held on. And because of that, I'm alive. My daughter is alive. That's not a curse. That's a vow." The documentary was never finished. The filmmaker said the story was too heavy, too raw, too intimate to be told by someone outside the family. She returned the footage to the woman who had spoken and walked away from the project. But the story didn't end, because the Crawford children are still being born, and they still carry the scar, and they still hear the song. Some of them are scared, some of them are angry, some of them have learned to live with it, the way you live with a scar from childhood, always there, always visible, but part of who you are. And some of them have started singing back. In 2024, a woman named Grace Crawford recorded herself singing the melody, the one embedded in her DNA, the one Miriam sang as she died. She posted it online, with no explanation, no context, just the song. Within a week, dozens of other Crawford descendants had added their voices, a harmony, a choir of the living, singing the song of the dead. No one knows what it means. No one knows if Miriam can hear it, wherever she is. But the Crawfords keep singing, because some memories refuse to die. Some truths refuse to stay buried. And some mothers refuse to let their children forget. The scar remains. The song remains. And somewhere, in the blood of every Crawford child yet to be born, Miriam remains. Waiting, watching, singing. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and let us know. And remember, some family secrets are kept for a reason, but some are kept alive because they're the only proof we ever existed at all. Thank you for watching.